My name is Aria, and I'm 32 years old. I've dedicated my life to working at a homeless shelter, finding purpose in helping those society often forgets. My mother, always the perfectionist, never approved. Last Thanksgiving, I arrived late after helping a resident through a medical crisis. As my family sat around the table, my mother looked me up and down and declared loudly, "You reek like garbage." Her words cut deep, but what happened next changed everything. For once, I didn't shrink away or apologize for existing. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to someone who tried to diminish your worth. I grew up in an affluent suburb in Connecticut where appearances mattered more than anything else. Our house was a sprawling colonial with perfectly manicured lawns featured twice in Home and Garden magazine, thanks to my mother's obsessive attention to detail. My father, Robert, was a respected cardiac surgeon at the state's top hospital. My mother, Diane, was what people politely called a socialite. She ran charity galas, sat on the boards of cultural institutions, and scrutinized everyone and everything with the precision my father used in the operating room. From my earliest memories, I was never quite enough for my mother. My younger sister, Catherine, however, seemed to effortlessly embody everything our mother valued. She was naturally graceful, excelled academically without seeming to try, and always knew the right thing to wear or say. I, on the other hand, was awkward, dreamy, and perpetually falling short of expectations. When I was 10, I spent weeks working on an art project for school, a colorful, abstract painting that my teacher had praised. I brought it home, proudly displaying it on the refrigerator. My mother took one look at it and said, "Aria, this is messy. Is this really your best work? Look at how Catherine's watercolors are so precise." She removed my painting and replaced it with my sister's more conventional landscape. I found my artwork in the recycling bin the next day. By 16, I had learned to expect disappointment. For my junior prom, I saved up money from my part-time job to buy a dress I loved, a deep purple gown with silver accents. When I came downstairs the night of the dance, ready to leave, my mother sighed dramatically. "That dress looks so cheap, Aria. Everyone will know you bought it at the mall. I told you we could have gone shopping together." She took photos anyway, but later I overheard her telling a friend on the phone that I make such odd choices. My college graduation should have been a celebration, but even that achievement was tarnished. I had graduated with honors from a prestigious university, not the state school I had actually wanted to attend, but the alma mater my parents insisted upon. As we posed for family photos after the ceremony, my mother fussed with my hair under my cap. "Couldn't you have done something better with it? It looks so flat. Catherine always looks so put together at these events." I was 22 years old and should have been proud, but I felt like a failure. My father rarely intervened in these interactions. He worked long hours at the hospital and seemed to view his family as another project to be managed efficiently. Occasionally, when my mother's criticism became particularly harsh, he would say something mild like, "Diane, that's enough," but he never truly challenged her behavior. In some ways, his emotional distance was as damaging as my mother's active criticism. The real rebellion of my life came when I chose my career path. Both my parents had assumed I would follow either my father into medicine or pursue law, as many of our family friends' children had done. Instead, after volunteering at a homeless shelter during college, I decided to pursue social work. When I announced this at a family dinner, my mother actually laughed, thinking I was joking. When she realized I was serious, her face hardened. "You'll be throwing your education away," she said flatly. "All that money for you to hand out sandwiches to drug addicts." My father's disappointment was quieter but equally palpable. "You have the intelligence to do more, Aria," he said, "to really make something of yourself." But I had found something that felt meaningful in a way that their approved career paths never had. Working with people who had lost everything gave me perspective on what really mattered. For the first time, I felt like I was making a tangible difference in the world. Over the next decade, the distance between my family and me grew. I took a position at Harbor Hope, a shelter in the city, about 40 minutes from my parents' suburb. I found a small apartment nearby, nothing fancy but cozy and mine. Every time my mother visited, which was rarely, she would look around with thinly veiled disgust, making comments about when you decide to live like an adult, or such a waste of your potential. Catherine had followed the prescribed path, becoming a dermatologist with a thriving practice catering to the same wealthy community we'd grown up in. She married another doctor, lived in a house almost as large as our parents', and gave birth to twin boys who became the center of my parents' world. Although we remained cordial, the gap between our lives made it hard to maintain the closeness we'd had as small children. Dating was complicated by my family dynamics. My last serious relationship had ended 6 months before that fateful Thanksgiving. After meeting my family at a birthday dinner for my father, Mark had been overwhelmed. "It's like watching someone slowly deflate you," he said afterward. "I don't understand how you can just sit there and take it." We tried to make it work for another month, but the strain of my family's judgment and my inability to stand up to them ultimately drove us apart. Through it all, my work at the shelter remained my anchor. Over 7 years, I had moved up from volunteer coordinator to assistant director. I knew every resident by name, knew their stories, their struggles, and their small victories. I had helped people find housing, reconnect with estranged family members, and navigate the labyrinthine social services system. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was real and meaningful in a way that nothing in my childhood had prepared me for. Thanksgiving had become a particularly dreaded holiday. The focus on family togetherness made the dysfunction in mine all the more apparent. For the past few years, I had found excuses to work the holiday volunteering to cover so that colleagues with children could be with their families. But this year, my grandmother Margaret, my father's mother and the only family member who seemed to truly accept me as I was, had been ill. She had specifically requested that all of us be together, and I couldn't refuse her. Little did I know that this particular Thanksgiving would change everything. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned cold and clear. I had prepared as best I could, laying out a modest but nice outfit, planning to arrive at my parents' home with plenty of time to help with last-minute preparations, even buying a small but expensive bottle of my mother's favorite wine as a peace offering. I had rehearsed neutral conversation topics and prepared myself mentally for the usual barrage of subtle criticisms and comparisons to Catherine. Then at 9:17 a.m., everything changed. I was at the shelter doing a quick check-in before heading home to get ready when Marion collapsed. Marion was a 62-year-old woman who had been staying with us for nearly 3 months after losing her apartment following a lengthy hospitalization. She had been making progress, had a housing application in process, and had become something of a grandmother figure to many of our younger residents. The seizure came without warning. One minute she was helping in the kitchen preparing vegetables for the shelter's Thanksgiving meal, and the next she was on the floor, her body rigid and then convulsing. I called 911 while our staff nurse monitored her vital signs. The ambulance took nearly 20 minutes to arrive, minutes that stretched like hours as we worked to keep her airway clear and prevent her from injuring herself. When the paramedics finally loaded her into the ambulance, I climbed in with her, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. At the hospital, I provided her medical history to the doctors and stayed until her daughter could arrive from 2 hours away. By the time Marion was stable and I felt comfortable leaving, it was already past 2 in the afternoon. My phone had been buzzing consistently throughout the ordeal. First with texts from my sister. "Mom is on a warpath about the centerpieces. Come early if you can." Then, "Where are you dinners at 4 and you know how she gets when people are late." Finally, "Seriously, Aria, she's already complained about you 3 times and you're not even here yet." Dad's retreated to his study. I texted back a brief explanation about the emergency at the shelter, but I knew it wouldn't matter. In my mother's world, nothing was more important than family obligations, certainly not the health crisis of a homeless woman. There was no time to go home and shower or change as I'd planned. I did my best in the hospital bathroom, washing my face and hands, trying to smooth my hair and applying some lipstick I found in the bottom of my purse. My clothes, dark jeans, a burgundy sweater, and boots, were respectable enough, but not the dress and heels that would have been expected. There was also no hiding the fact that I smelled like the hospital's harsh soap mixed with the lingering scent of the shelter's institutional cleaning products. The drive to my parents' house was tense, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I rehearsed explanations that I knew would fall on deaf ears. The autumn sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained lawns of my parents' neighborhood. Each house seemed to be trying to outdo the others with elaborate Thanksgiving decorations, harvest wreaths, artfully arranged gourds, and tasteful lighting. My parents' house outshone them all, of course. The driveway was lined with small lanterns, and the front door boasted an extravagant fall arrangement that probably cost more than many of our shelter residents made in a month. Through the large front windows, I could see the dining room table already set with the fine china crystal and silver that only emerged for special occasions. Taking a deep breath, I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, already positioning myself as a guest rather than family. My sister Catherine opened the door, her face a mask of carefully controlled stress. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, pulling me inside. "She's been impossible." Catherine looked perfect as always, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo, her figure flattered by an expensive-looking navy dress, subtle makeup enhancing her natural beauty. Next to her, I felt even more disheveled than I actually was. "I'm sorry," I said. "There was an emergency at the shelter. One of our residents had a seizure and—" "Save it," Catherine interrupted, glancing over her shoulder. "Just come in and try to fly under the radar. Aunt Sarah and Uncle David are here with the cousins, and Grandma Margaret is having a good day." I handed her the wine bottle. "Maybe this will help." Catherine gave me a skeptical look, but took the bottle. "I'll put it with the others. Mom's in the kitchen supervising the caterers." The house smelled amazing. Roasting turkey, fresh bread, and the cinnamon apple scent that my mother insisted on every fall. The living room was filled with relatives making pre-dinner conversation. My father's sister Sarah greeted me warmly, asking genuine questions about my work. Her husband David gave me a sympathetic smile. He had never quite fit the family mold, either working as a high school teacher rather than pursuing a more lucrative career. Their college-aged children, my cousins Jackson and Emma, were politely distant, unsure how to relate to the family outlier. Grandmother Margaret was seated in the place of honor near the fireplace. Despite her recent health struggles, she looked regal in a vintage dress with an amethyst brooch I remembered from my childhood. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Aria, my dear," she said, extending her hand. "Come sit with me and tell me about your work. How is that young mother doing? The one with the twins?" Before I could answer, my mother swept into the room. Diane Parker was a striking woman in her early 60s, her blonde hair expertly colored and styled, her slim figure showcased in an elegant cream-colored dress. She had the kind of beauty that had been cultivated through decades of careful maintenance and considerable expense. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw me taking in my casual clothes and slightly disheveled appearance. "Aria, you finally decided to join us. We were beginning to think you weren't coming." "I'm sorry I'm late," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was an emergency at the shelter. One of our residents—" Yes, my mother interrupted with a dismissive wave. "There's always some crisis, isn't there? Well, you're here now, though you might have found time to change." Her gaze traveled from my boots to my hair, cataloging every flaw. My father emerged from his study, then giving me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "Good to see you, Aria," he said, his tone suggesting he was addressing a distant acquaintance rather than his daughter. The next hour was a minefield of subtle insults and pointed questions. My mother managed to comment on everything from my hair. "When was your last proper cut?" to my career prospects. Sarah. "Did you know?" Aria turned down a position at the county social services office, much more stable with benefits. To my single status. Such a shame about Mark. He seemed like he had potential. I tried to stay positive, focused on my grandmother's genuine interest and my aunt's kind questions about the shelter. But the tension kept building, especially when I accidentally knocked over a glass of red wine while reaching for the breadbasket. Though I quickly blotted it with my napkin, preventing any real damage to the pristine tablecloth, my mother's expression suggested I'd committed an unforgivable sin. "Really, Aria," she sighed, "you've always been so careless." Finally, mercifully, the caterers announced that dinner was ready to be served. We moved to the dining room, a formal space rarely used except for holidays, and my mother's occasional dinner parties. The table gleamed with silver and crystal elaborate flower arrangements, interspersed with tasteful fall decorations. Name cards in my mother's perfect calligraphy marked each person's place. Mine, I noticed, was as far from hers as possible between my teenage cousins. As we settled into our seats, I allowed myself to hope that the worst was over. Surely, with food to focus on and the structured formality of the meal, the criticisms would abate. I caught Catherine's eye across the table, and she gave me a small, encouraging smile. I couldn't have been more wrong. Before the first course could be served, my mother clinked her crystal water glass with a silver spoon, calling for attention. "As is our tradition," she announced, "I'd like us all to share what we're thankful for this year. I'll start." This was a family ritual I had always dreaded. Each year, it seemed to become less about gratitude and more about showcasing accomplishments and affirming the family mythology of success and perfection. My mother smoothed her napkin across her lap. "This year, I am thankful for our continued good health, for Richard's successful new cardiac procedure that was written up in the medical journal, and of course for Catherine and William's beautiful boys starting at Brightwood Academy." She smiled at my sister. "And for Catherine's dermatology practice being named in Connecticut Magazine's Top Doctors issue for the third year running." My father went next, his gratitude focused primarily on professional achievements and the new boat he had purchased. Then it was Catherine's turn. "I'm thankful for my amazing husband and sons," she said, her voice softer than our parents, "and for the work-life balance I finally managed to achieve this year." She glanced at me, and I could see the genuine exhaustion behind her perfect facade. For a moment, I felt a connection with my sister that had been missing for years. Around the table it went. Aunt Sarah grateful for her students' achievements, Uncle David for a fishing trip he'd taken with friends' cousins for college acceptances and sports victories, Grandmother Margaret for another year with my beautiful family despite doctors' predictions. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, determined to focus on the positive. "I'm thankful for the work I get to do at Harbor Hope. This year we've helped 23 people transition into permanent housing, and our job training program has placed 15 residents in stable employment. I'm particularly grateful for—" "Really, Aria," my mother interrupted, her voice sharp. "Must you always talk about those people? This is a family gathering." I felt heat rise to my face but continued. "As I was saying, I'm particularly grateful for our new partnership with the community college, which is providing scholarships for—" "Good Lord," my mother cut in, again louder this time. "What is that smell?" She made a show of wrinkling her nose and looking around before her gaze landed pointedly on me. "Aria, did you even bother to shower before coming here? You reek like garbage. How do you expect anyone to take you seriously when you can't even present yourself properly?" The table fell silent. My Aunt Sarah looked down at her plate, clearly embarrassed. My Uncle David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. Catherine's face flushed red, and she shot our mother a look of disbelief. My father cleared his throat, making a weak attempt to change the subject. "The turkey looks excellent this year," he said, his voice artificially bright. "Is that a new glazing technique?" But no one responded. My grandmother was staring at my mother with open disapproval, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I sat frozen, my mother's words ringing in my ears. "You reek like garbage." It wasn't the first time she had insulted me, of course, but something about the public nature of this attack, the deliberate cruelty of it, broke through a wall inside me. I felt my shame transform into something else, a slow-burning anger that had been suppressed for decades. I looked around at my family, some embarrassed, some uncomfortable, but none of them defending me. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would not leave the table in tears as I had so many times before. I would not swallow the hurt and pretend everything was fine. Instead, I slowly stood up my napkin, falling to the floor. Everyone tensed, clearly expecting me to storm out. My mother's face already showed the smug satisfaction of having won another round. They had no idea what was coming next. "I'd like to tell you about my day," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The room remained silent, all eyes on me. I could see confusion on most faces. This wasn't the tearful retreat they expected. This morning at 9:17, a woman named Marion collapsed in our shelter kitchen. Marion is 62 years old. She worked as a nurse's aide for 40 years before a series of strokes left her unable to work. When her medical bills exceeded her savings, she lost her apartment. Her adult daughter lives in a one-bedroom with 2 children and couldn't take her in. I looked directly at my mother as I continued. Marion had a grand mal seizure on our kitchen floor. I held her head to prevent injury while our staff nurse monitored her breathing until paramedics arrived. In the ambulance, I held her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, terrified and confused. At the hospital, I advocated for her treatment because she has no health insurance. I stayed with her until her daughter could drive in from Hartford. The details of Marion's medical emergency seemed to make my mother uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat and opened her mouth to interrupt, but I continued before she could speak. "I came here directly from the hospital. I didn't have time to go home and shower or change into whatever outfit you would have deemed appropriate for today. I smell like hospital antiseptic and shelter cleaning products, not garbage. And even if I did smell like garbage, would that make me less worthy of basic respect at this table?" My voice grew stronger as I continued, years of suppressed feelings finally finding expression. "For as long as I can remember, you've made me feel less than. My clothes were never right. My achievements were never enough. My career choice was a disappointment. Nothing I have ever done has earned your approval or even your basic respect." I turned to address the whole table now. I've spent years in therapy trying to undo the damage of growing up believing I was fundamentally flawed. 2 years of weekly sessions working through the anxiety and depression that come from never feeling good enough, from believing that my worth as a person was tied to external validation that never came. My mother's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Aria, this is hardly the time or place for your dramatics." "When would be the right time, Mom?" I asked. "When we're alone, so no one else has to witness how you speak to me, so the family mythology of perfection can continue unchallenged." I shook my head. "No, I've spent 32 years being silent, trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. I'm done." I looked at my father, whose face showed a mixture of discomfort and shame. "Dad, you've watched this happen my entire life and said nothing. Your silence has been its own kind of cruelty." Catherine was crying silently, tears streaming down her perfect makeup. I felt a pang of regret for putting her in this position, but pushed forward. "I've allowed this pattern to continue by showing up time after time, hoping things might be different, swallowing the hurt, and pretending it doesn't matter. That's on me, and it stops today." I took a deep breath, centering myself before delivering my final thoughts. "The people you dismiss as those people have taught me more about dignity, resilience, and genuine human connection than I ever learned in this house. They've helped me find my worth outside of your narrow definition of success. And they've shown me that I deserve respect simply for being human." I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and set it down carefully. "So no, Mom, I don't smell like garbage. But this relationship has been toxic for years, and I won't poison myself with it anymore." Then, instead of walking out as everyone clearly expected, I calmly sat back down and served myself a portion of mashed potatoes. "The food does look delicious," I said, echoing my father's earlier attempt at deflection. "Is that a new glazing technique on the turkey?" The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's face had gone from pale to mottled red. "Well," she finally managed, her voice tight, "I see you've developed quite a flair for the dramatic. Perhaps you missed your calling in theater rather than social work." Before anyone else could speak, my grandmother's voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Diane. Her tone was sharp in a way I'd rarely heard. Aria has said nothing but the truth, and it's long overdue. My mother looked genuinely shocked. Mother Margaret, you can't possibly condone this kind of outburst at Thanksgiving dinner. My grandmother fixed her with a steady gaze. What I don't condone is the way you've treated my granddaughter for decades. Richard, she turned to my father, your silence on this matter has been deeply disappointing. And just like that, the power dynamic at the table shifted. The carefully constructed facade of family perfection had cracked, and through that crack, long-suppressed truths were beginning to emerge. For several minutes, no one seemed to know what to do. The caterers hovered awkwardly at the edges of the room, unsure whether to begin serving. My father finally nodded to them, and they moved forward with practiced efficiency, placing the first course in front of each person. My mother picked up her fork and began eating as if nothing unusual had happened, though her hand trembled slightly. The rest of us followed suit. The silence broken only by the clink of silverware against fine china. It was my cousin Emma who finally attempted normal conversation, asking her brother about his college applications. The discussion was stilted at first, but gradually others joined in, clearly relieved to have something else to focus on. Throughout the first course, my mother remained silent, a cold fury radiating from her rigid posture. My father ate mechanically, his usual confident demeanor notably diminished. I focused on my food, my heart still racing from the confrontation, but a strange sense of lightness beginning to spread through my chest. As the main course was being served, my father surprised everyone by clearing his throat and addressing me directly. "Aria," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I owe you an apology. You're right. I've witnessed your mother's treatment of you and failed to intervene. That was cowardly of me." My mother's head snapped toward him. "Richard, how dare you?" "No, Diane." He interrupted something he rarely did. "This needs to be said. Our daughter deserves better than what she's received from us, from both of us." The admission was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. After a moment, I simply nodded, acknowledging his words without necessarily accepting the apology they contained. Then, to everyone's surprise, my Uncle David spoke up. "I've been on the receiving end of Diane's disapproval, too," he said, glancing at my mother, though never as severely as Aria. When Sarah and I decided I would teach rather than pursue law, the comments were difficult to bear. My Aunt Sarah reached for his hand. "We should have said something years ago. I'm sorry, Aria." The conversation opened like a floodgate. Catherine, tears still drying on her cheeks, confessed that she too suffered under our mother's impossible standards. "Nothing is ever enough," she said quietly. "The right school, the right career, the right husband, the right children. There's always something more to fix, to improve. I'm exhausted trying to be perfect." My mother looked genuinely shocked at Catherine's words. Her perfect daughter, her ally, was now speaking out against her too. "Catherine, that's simply not true. I've always been your biggest supporter." "You've been my biggest critic," Catherine corrected gently. "Your support has always been conditional on my meeting your expectations." My grandmother Margaret, who had been listening intently, finally spoke again. "Diane," she said, "your behavior didn't emerge from nowhere. Your mother, Richard's mother, was a deeply critical woman who never gave you the approval you sought. I watched you try to earn her love for years, changing yourself to meet her standards. It broke my heart then, as it breaks my heart now, to see you perpetuating the same pattern with your daughters." My mother's face flushed. "This is absurd. I've given my daughters every advantage, every opportunity. Their success has been my life's work." "And that's the problem," I said, finding my voice again. "Our success was never meant to be for us. It was always about you, about reflecting well on you, validating your choices, meeting your needs. We were extensions of you, not people in our own right." My mother stood abruptly, her napkin falling to the floor. "I will not sit here and be attacked in my own home at my own table. If this is the gratitude I receive for decades of sacrifice, then perhaps we should end this dinner now." She looked expectantly at my father, clearly waiting for him to back her up. But my father remained seated. "Diane," he said quietly, "sit down. We need to hear this." It was the first time I could remember my father directly contradicting my mother in public. Her face registered shock, then betrayal before settling into a cold mask. Without another word, she turned and left the dining room, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor of the hallway. My father sighed deeply and looked around the table. "I apologize for the disruption," he said formally. "Please continue with your meal." But the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. My mother's dramatic exit had left a void at the table, and no one quite knew how to proceed. I felt simultaneously liberated and guilty, the familiar weight of responsibility for others' emotions settling on my shoulders despite my best efforts to shed it. "I should probably go," I said, beginning to rise. "No, please stay," my grandmother said, reaching across to touch my hand. "For too long, this family has prioritized keeping the peace over speaking truth. It's time that changed." I settled back into my chair, surprised by the support. The rest of the meal continued in a strange mixture of tension and unexpected honesty. My aunt shared stories of growing up with my mother, providing context I'd never had before. My father, more subdued than I'd ever seen him, mostly listened, occasionally nodding or adding a brief comment. When dessert was served, my mother's famous pumpkin cheesecake presented by the caterers in her absence, Catherine asked if she could speak to me privately. We excused ourselves and stepped into the kitchen where staff were efficiently cleaning up. "I'm so sorry," Catherine said as soon as we were alone, her voice breaking. "I've watched how she treats you for years and said nothing. I was so afraid that if I spoke up, I'd become the target too." The admission hurt, but I understood it. "You were protecting yourself," I said. "We all develop survival strategies." Catherine nodded, tears welling again. "You should know. I've been struggling too. I have anxiety so bad I can barely function some days. I've been on medication for years. And last year when I lost all that weight that Mom was so proud of, it wasn't healthy. I was barely eating." I felt a surge of compassion for my sister, seeing for the first time how the perfect exterior concealed her own pain. "Have you talked to anyone about this professionally, I mean?" She shook her head. "Mom says therapy is for people who are weak or broken, that Parker women handle their problems privately." "That's exactly the kind of toxic thinking that keeps us trapped," I said gently. "Seeking help isn't weakness. It's one of the bravest things you can do." For the first time in years, I reached out and hugged my sister. She stiffened initially, then melted into the embrace, sobbing against my shoulder. We stood like that for several minutes, breaking apart, only when one of the caterers discreetly entered to retrieve more dessert plates. When we returned to the dining room, the family was engaged in subdued conversation. My grandmother caught my eye and gave me a small, approving nod. Despite everyone's insistence that I stay, I decided it was time to leave. The emotional toll of the day, from Marion's seizure to the confrontation with my mother, had left me drained. I said my goodbyes, receiving unexpectedly warm embraces from family members who had been distant for years. My grandmother held my hands tightly in hers. "You've always been my brave one," she whispered. "Don't let this fire go out." I left without seeing my mother again. As I drove home in the gathering darkness, I felt like I had shed a weight I'd been carrying my entire life. I had finally spoken my truth, and while the sky hadn't fallen, nothing would ever be the same. That night alone in my apartment, I alternated between feelings of empowerment and waves of doubt. Had I gone too far? Should I have chosen a different time, a different approach? The therapist in me knew that confrontation rarely leads to immediate change, especially with someone as deeply entrenched in their patterns as my mother. But the wounded daughter in me kept replaying the moment I finally stood up for myself, savoring the brief taste of liberation. I slept fitfully, waking early the next morning to a text from my father. "Can we meet for coffee today? Just the two of us?" We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. My father arrived looking unusually disheveled, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of a difficult night. He ordered a black coffee and sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "Your mother didn't come home last night," he began. "She went to a hotel. Said she needed space to think." I nodded, unsurprised. I imagine yesterday was challenging for her. My father gave a humorless laugh. "That's one word for it." He paused, staring into his coffee. "I've never seen her that shaken. Not in 40 years of marriage." "Dad," I said carefully, "I didn't say what I said to hurt her, or you, but it needed to be said." "I know." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "And I should have said it years ago, or at least supported you when you tried to address it." He shook his head. "I told myself I was keeping the peace, being the mediator. But the truth is, I was a coward. It was easier to let her focus her perfectionism on you girls than to confront it myself." The admission was startling in its honesty. My father had always presented himself as the rational, unflappable head of the family. Seeing him acknowledge his weakness was both disconcerting and strangely comforting. "Why?" I asked simply. "Why did you let it go on for so long?" He sighed deeply. "Your grandmother was right about Diane's childhood. Her mother, your other grandmother, was brutally critical. Nothing Diane did was ever good enough. I saw how it wounded her, and I think I felt sorry for her. I thought if I could just give her the perfect life, the perfect family she craved, she would heal." He shook his head again. "Instead, I enabled her to perpetuate the same pattern." He went on to explain more about my mother's background, details I'd never known. Her mother's alcoholism, her father's emotional absence, the financial insecurity they'd experienced after his business failed. My mother's drive for perfection and security suddenly made more sense, though it didn't excuse her behavior. "She may never change," my father said finally. "She may not be capable of it. Her patterns are deeply ingrained, and she's never acknowledged the need for help." He reached across the table and took my hand, a rare gesture of physical affection from him. "But that doesn't mean you need to keep subjecting yourself to it. You deserve better, Aria. I'm sorry I didn't ensure you received it." We talked for nearly 2 hours, covering territory that had been off-limits for decades. For the first time, I felt like my father was seeing me, really seeing me, as an adult, with valid feelings and experiences. When we parted, he hugged me tightly, another rarity that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The weeks following Thanksgiving brought seismic shifts in our family dynamics. Catherine called me regularly, our conversations gradually becoming more authentic and supportive. She started seeing a therapist of her own, taking the first steps toward addressing her anxiety and disordered eating. My grandmother invited me to weekly lunch dates, sharing family stories and wisdom I'd never been privy to before. Even my Aunt Sarah began volunteering at the shelter once a month, developing a genuine interest in the work I found so meaningful. My mother, however, remained distant. She refused to discuss what had happened, insisting to anyone who would listen that I had caused a scene and ruined Thanksgiving with my inappropriate outburst. When my father suggested family counseling, she flatly refused. "There's nothing wrong with me," she insisted. "It's Aria who needs help." As Christmas approached, the traditional invitation to the annual Parker family celebration arrived in my mailbox. For the first time in my adult life, I declined without making excuses. Instead, I organized a special holiday meal at the shelter, inviting staff and residents to contribute dishes that held meaning for them. My grandmother came, as did Catherine, and surprisingly my father, his first visit to my workplace in the 7 years I'd been there. It was at the shelter Christmas celebration that I met Michael. He was a new volunteer, a soft-spoken architect who had recently moved to the area and wanted to give back to the community. We bonded over serving ham and sweet potatoes, and later as we washed dishes together, he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime. On our first date, I found myself telling him about the Thanksgiving confrontation. I'd been hesitant to share such personal information so early, but something about Michael's attentive presence made it feel safe. When I finished the story, I waited for the judgment or discomfort that usually followed such revelations. Instead, he said simply, Thank you for trusting me with that. It takes enormous courage to break family patterns like that. My own father was challenging. It took me years to establish healthy boundaries. That response, understanding without pity, recognition without judgment, was the first indicator that Michael might be different from previous partners who had either been overwhelmed by my family drama or dismissive of its impact. As our relationship developed over the following months, I found myself applying the lessons from therapy in real time. I communicated clearly about my needs and boundaries. I expressed my feelings without apologizing for having them. I allowed myself to be vulnerable without expecting rejection. And Michael responded with consistent kindness and respect, never using my insecurities as weapons during disagreements. Professionally, my work at the shelter continued to evolve. In February, we received a significant grant to expand our job training program, an achievement that earned me recognition from the City Council. When the local newspaper ran a feature on the shelter's success stories, including Marion's recovery and subsequent housing placement, I received congratulatory messages from everyone in my family except my mother. The clarity I had found on Thanksgiving continued to guide my decisions. I set firm boundaries with my father about discussing my mother. I would listen to updates if he needed to share, but I wouldn't be drawn into triangulation or peacemaking. With Catherine, I was honest about my need to develop our relationship independently from our parents' influence. And with myself, I practiced self-compassion when old patterns of people-pleasing or perfectionism emerged. In April, a thick cream envelope arrived in my mailbox, my mother's distinctive stationery. Inside was a brief note. "I'll be at Harbor Hope next Tuesday at 10 a.m. I'd like to see your work. Mother." No apology, no acknowledgement of our estrangement, just a statement of intent. It was so typically her that I almost laughed. After considering declining, I decided to accept the visit on my terms. I texted back a simple confirmation, adding that Tuesday was our busiest day, and I would have limited time to give her a tour. 6 months after the Thanksgiving confrontation, my mother walked through the doors of Harbor Hope for the first time. She was impeccably dressed as always, looking oddly out of place amid the shelter's practical furnishings and diverse clientele. Her eyes scanned the space with clinical detachment, taking in details that I knew she was mentally cataloging for critique. "Thank you for coming," I said, formally extending my hand, rather than attempting a hug I knew neither of us wanted. She shook it briefly. "Your father speaks of this place often now. I thought I should see it for myself." I gave her an abbreviated tour explaining our programs and services, without the emotional investment I usually brought to such presentations. She asked few questions, her expression revealing little. When we passed the kitchen where Marion now volunteered teaching cooking skills to younger residents, I introduced them briefly. "So you're Aria's mother," Marion said warmly. "You must be very proud of her. She's changing lives here every day." My mother's smile was tight. "Yes, Aria has always been dedicated to her causes." It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't the dismissal she might have offered before. I counted it as progress of a sort. As the tour concluded, we stood awkwardly in my small office. I waited, wondering if there was more to this visit than curiosity or an attempt to gather ammunition for future criticism. "Your grandmother speaks very highly of your work," my mother said, finally adjusting her designer handbag on her arm. "She says you've created something meaningful here." I nodded, recognizing that this was as close to acknowledgement as she could currently manage. "I have. It's not the path you would have chosen for me, but it's where I belong." My mother's gaze flickered around the office, taking in the thank you cards from former residents pinned to a bulletin board, the social work degree in a simple frame, the photos of shelter events where I stood surrounded by staff and residents smiling broadly. "You look content," she said, as if the concept was foreign to her. "I am," I replied simply. She nodded once decisively. "Well, I should let you get back to work. Thank you for the tour." As she turned to leave, she paused in the doorway. "Your father and I are hosting a dinner next month for the hospital board. Catherine mentioned you're seeing someone new. You're welcome to bring him if you'd like." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a direct acknowledgement of the rift between us. but it was an opening, however small. I considered declining on principle, but the past 6 months had taught me that healing rarely comes through all or nothing approaches. "I'll think about it," I said. "Thank you for the invitation." After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time processing the interaction. My mother might never fully change. She might never be capable of the warm, supportive relationship I had craved as a child. But perhaps we could build something new, a relationship between adults with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. The realization was both liberating and a little sad. I was letting go of the fantasy that my mother would someday transform into the parent I needed. Instead, I was accepting the reality of who she was, who I was, and what might be possible between us. A year after that fateful Thanksgiving, I hosted my own gathering at the small house Michael and I had recently purchased together. It was nothing like my mother's elaborate productions. The table was mismatched. The food was a potluck of everyone's favorites, and the guest list included an eclectic mix of shelter colleagues, friends, and family members. My grandmother Margaret was there holding court from the most comfortable chair in the living room. Catherine and her husband came without their children who were spending the holiday with his parents, a boundary Catherine had finally felt empowered to set. My father arrived alone. My mother had chosen to attend a friend's dinner instead. It was a choice we all understood and accepted without drama. As I looked around the table at this chosen family, some related by blood, others by deeper connections, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from that moment of standing up at my mother's table to creating this new tradition had been challenging but necessary. I had found my voice not just in that single confrontation, but in the 100 small choices that followed. When Marion raised her glass and said, "I'm thankful for second chances and for found family," I felt tears prick my eyes. I caught Michael's gaze across the table, and his warm smile reflected back to me everything I had learned, that true worth comes from within, that authentic connection requires vulnerability, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply speak our truth. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who tried to diminish your worth? How did you find the courage to speak your truth? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else find their voice. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and growth, and share it with someone who might need to know they're not alone. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I hope you find the strength to honor your own worth today and every day.